Hi guys, Miss Blanchard here. I don't know if you can see me or not because the little light didn't come on, but we are going to work on this presentation that I posted on the classroom. The link's right there on the weekly assignments. It would also be handy to have out your packets maybe. I forgot to flip back to the start of mine. So actually, let's start real quick with a mention on page 11 here when we get to it. But this presentation is really on like the 1950s, and Eisenhower very much comes to define the 1950s. Truman is still president for 2 years or so in the 1950s, 51, 52. He does not run for re-election in 52. So then Eisenhower wins the election in 52 and is inaugurated, therefore, in January of 1953. So here are two pictures of Eisenhower, Dwight D. Eisenhower. Here he is in his military uniform. He had been the Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. And here he is in his presidential portrait. Yes, he looks a little bit older on the left, but I think because they have makeup and lights and everything on the right. So after World War II, Eisenhower did retire from the Army. He had actually gone to work as an executive for a few years, and then the Republicans asked him to run in 1952. You might remember from the Korean War video that I'd also mentioned that MacArthur, after he'd been fired by Truman, had threatened to run in 1952, but that was very short-lived. So here you have this moment where he might have had two war generals, military generals, fighting for the nomination in 1952, but MacArthur was a flash in the pan. So let's talk a little bit, just to go back a little bit. Truman, we had watched the video and talked about in class the Fair Deal, which was his attempt to extend the New Deal after World War II. He wanted to do a few things, but most of it is blocked by Congress, who sees anything too socialistic as like this Cold War fight. So really not much goes through. The second bullet point here, these reforms came in the wake of the government canceling millions in war contracts and 5 million people lose their jobs. So after 1945, after the war is over, really in 1946, 47, a little bit into 1948, the economy is not doing well. We don't increase the minimum wage. We don't increase spending on education or agriculture. We do cancel all of these government projects, from during the war production. There's a lot of unemployment, and without the passage of the Fair Deal, as well as other, just natural changes into the economy goes through a little bit of a post-war dip, which is actually very common, especially after industrial wars and total wars. In the 1948 election, Truman won, or he runs. He had been FDR's vice president. We had talked about that in class, and he does serve most of FDR's unprecedented fourth term. Congress, we said the second bullet point here, fails to pass really most of Truman's Fair Deal proposals. Truman also desegregated the military. That's probably one of his biggest lasting impacts there, and political maneuvers. As the chief executive, he does not need Congress's permission to do that, so it's done through executive order. So there is some debate among historians. Some historians will then say that really the Korean War is the first integrated war. You don't really see lots of examples, though, of racial integration, although by law, de jure, we'll learn about de jure and de facto. De jure, it is integrated. De facto, just the results and the facts of life. It's really not all that integrated. So really we'll have to wait until Vietnam to see a really integrated military. So Truman has an aggressive election in 1948, blasting the do-nothing Republicans. And you see in this paper over here, very famous newspaper, based on exit polls, the Chicago Tribune, the Daily Tribune, as it was called back then, had actually predicted that Dewey was going to defeat him. And then when the election results come in the next morning, that, in fact, Truman did win. What the military integration had resulted in, I don't think I have a copy of the electoral map, is that in the South, you have the creation of the Dixiecrat Party, Southern Democrats who move away from Truman and Truman's embracing of civil rights. We could talk about it more in depth later in the civil rights unit, but it is more than just integrating the military. Truman is very sympathetic to African Americans and their lack of rights in the 1940s. So Southern Democrats still can't bring themselves to form or to join the Republican Party. So they go on and create a Dixiecrat Party, a Southern Democrat Party that's kind of somewhere between the Democrats and the Republicans. They're still blaming the Republicans for the Civil War and Reconstruction. But this is part of this long-term shift we've been talking about, going back to FDR, maybe even a little bit earlier in the 20s and 30s, of how a lot of Southerners moved from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party, white Southerners. And the 22nd Amendment is going to come into play here because the 22nd Amendment is passed in response to FDR's unprecedented 4 terms in office, or elected to 4 terms. He does die a few months into his 4th term. So Truman does not choose to run in 1952, partially I think largely because of what is going on with the Korean War. Although legally it did provide him a loophole. He could have run, but he chose not to run. So in 1952, Eisenhower, the picture we looked at the beginning, runs against who the Democrats nominate from Illinois, Adlai Stevenson. So let's take a look at Eisenhower's 1952 political commercial. Or not. I don't know why it didn't play. Come on, let's play. There we go.
I for president, I for president, I for president, I for president. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We don't want John or Dean or Harry. Let's do that big job right. Let's get in step with the guy that's hep. Get in step with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We got to get where we are going. Travel day and night for president. Let Adelaide go the other way.
Did you catch that? For Adlai Stevenson, vote the other way. And there's Adelaide riding the other way on the Democratic donkey. So vote for Adelaide, vote the other way. And then it goes on to say, me, I'll vote for Ike.
We all go with Ike. You like Ike, I like Ike. Everybody likes Ike for president. Hang out the banner, beat the drum. We'll take Ike to Washington. We'll take Ike to Washington.
Now is the time for all good Americans to come to the aid of their country.
Okay, so what do you see from that commercial? First of all, it's the first televised presidential campaign commercial ever. We will mention in 1960, you have the first televised presidential debate between actually Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, who's running and will lose in the 1960 election. He'll go on and win 8 years later. And JFK, John F. Kennedy for the Democrats. But this is the first televised presidential campaign commercial. It has an overwhelmingly positive message. I like Ike. We like Ike. There's no mention of the Cold War in it whatsoever, or any issues for that matter. And it has like this broad appeal. I think that goes along with the positive message. Lots of lifelong Democrats vote for Eisenhower, and there's a real shift in the Cold War in the 1950s. And this happens domestically, it happens in international, in which the Cold War becomes covert. And this I like Ike, we like Ike, very positive message comes to represent 1950s culture of conformity, complacency, and homogeneity, where some of the deeper issues, individualism, issues of the Cold War, fear of nuclear proliferation, becomes more covert rather than overt. And that is one, when we did the Socratic seminar groups on the 1950s foreign policy, that was one takeaway I hope you guys got, was that foreign policy went to very overt actions under Truman, the Marshall Plan, the Truman Doctrine, to more covert things, taking out foreign leaders, coups and overthrows, things that are done through the CIA and clandestinely. And you'll also see that domestically. So I hope you see this reflection domestically. We're not going to watch this in class. We would have, but this is Richard Nixon. He had been a senator, I believe one-term senator from California. He, like Joseph McCarthy from McCarthyism, had run on his World War II record. You'll see that with a lot of politicians for the next 30, 40 years after World War II. JFK runs on a World War II record. I would say Eisenhower runs on a World War II record. And he is, and this is a big shocker here, accused of taking illegal campaign contributions. And he gets on this commercial to defend himself. Here, I'll show you just a touch of it here at the beginning. Sorry.
One other thing I probably should tell you, because if I don't, they'll probably be saying this about me too.
We did get something to give after the election.
A man down in Texas heard past the radio mention the fact that our two youngsters would like to have a dog. And believe it or not, the day before we left on this campaign trip, we got a message from the Union Station in Baltimore saying they had a package for us. We went down to get it. You know what it was? It was a little Cocker Spaniel dog in a crate that he'd sent all the way from Texas.
Okay, that's all I'm going to play here. But a couple of things I want you to notice if you're watching at home. If you noticed, he held his hand over his face. He kind of has this hunched, disheveled appearance, right? This is the infancy of television. Today, politicians would have screen tests for their clothing, their ties. And that's an issue in one of the 1960 televised debates that Nixon's tie strobes on camera. Politicians learn how to dress better, which fabrics film well, which don't, how to sit with better posture better, and to not cover their face, things like that. And that'll go into Nixon's loss of the televised portion of the debates in 1960, is that he does not look good on television. And so this becomes known as the checker speech, because he says, yes, we did accept something. It wasn't an illegal campaign contribution. He releases his financial records. What he did receive and accept was a little Cocker Spaniel named Checkers. It's black and white dogs, so they called him Checkers. And so it becomes known as a checker speech. It's, Nixon kind of gets this reputation for being kind of humble, but very tough on communism. He had been on the House committee, in the Senate committee, and had gone after Alger Hiss and during the Alger Hiss hearings, and gone against communism. I had mentioned in class that Eisenhower's campaign slogan is K1C2, Korea first, ending the war in Korea, which we're about to talk about, communism and corruption second. And that's what Nixon very much represents in Eisenhower's cabinet, is going after corruption and communism, which the very funny thing is then that Nixon later becomes, like 20 years later, becomes the embodiment of government corruption, and especially political corruption, not so much government, but political corruption. So here are the results. This positive campaign is pretty successful. Even in the popular vote, winning 55% of the national vote is pretty significant. And then electorally, those Southern Democrats, the Dixiecrats that were formed in 1948, the Dixiecrat Party is not around, but you see this solid South, a solid South voting bloc starting to break up. Virginia, Tennessee, Florida, and Missouri go with the Republicans. Missouri had flipped a couple times in elections, but for Virginia, Tennessee, and I believe Florida, this is the first national election that they voted Democratic in. That they voted Republican in, I think ever, because, the Republican Party had just been formed at a national level in the presidential elections in 1960 for Lincoln. So a pretty big change starting to happen in our party alignment. So this is why I want to start on page 11, a real quick nod to McCarthyism. So on page 11, we have these, I've given you two different political cartoons. Here is a third one, all by one political cartoonist, Herb Locke. You see his signature here on this political cartoon. On the two I've given to you, you'll see it on the one with the car on the lower left-hand side and the one with the elephant on the right-hand side. And what McCarthyism has done has painted politicians into a corner in which, regardless of party affiliation, they really feel that they cannot ever be soft on communism. I really like the one that I've given you here on the right-hand side of your packet, where the Republican elephant is saying, "You mean I'm supposed to stand on that?" And it's this wobbly platform of McCarthyism that the Republicans feel that they have to support this McCarthyist platform. On the right, it's Herb Locke drawing out about McCarthy, but HUAC, and how they'll just run down innocent people in search of, we're hunting communists, in search of communists there, according to the caption. Here you see McCarthy saying, "We have documentary evidence that this man is planning a trip to Moscow." Well, of course he is. He's the ambassador to Russia. That is his job, to not just travel to Russia, but pretty much stay there for most of the year and live there as our ambassador there. So one thing that Eisenhower does is he does not want to take on McCarthy head first. But he feels that he has to support him at least overtly, maybe not covertly. So he allows McCarthy, and I love this quote, "just enough rope to hang himself," by allowing him to televise the Army hearings. And we had talked about this in class. It's when McCarthyism goes from going after the State Department to the Army. And what I think Eisenhower really was hoping, and does happen, is that Americans see McCarthy as unhinged, that his questions are these broad attacks. They're ad hoc, ad hominem attacks. They're baseless, sometimes nonsensical, leaving people unable to really defend themselves. And in this case, he's going after people who won World War II. These are the people who defeated the Nazis, defeated fascism in both Europe and the Pacific. And McCarthy just kind of comes off as a kook yelling at them, and really unfounded. And a lot of them really speak up for themselves well. We would have watched a little video in class, but we're not going to do that today. So it pretty much leads to the downfall of McCarthy. We watched in the one video that he is censured eventually by the Senate, and he fails to win re-election in Wisconsin, and actually dies, I believe, 4 years later from alcoholism. Oh yeah, and I love this quote. "I'm not going to get into a peeing contest with a skunk," Eisenhower says, the skunk being McCarthy. So he allows McCarthy pretty much to self-destruct. So, frustrated with the stalemate in Korea and the Red Scare, it led to a Republican presidential takeover in 1952. I told you the anecdote for the Truman and the Democrats was Eisenhower's campaign slogan of K1, Korea first, communism and corruption second. And notice this, scientific notation. We're in the nuclear age now, and more things are going to have a scientific appeal to them. Okay, so Ike does go to Korea. He overturns the UN battle plan, threatens China with nuclear war, and signs the armistice in 1953. There will be sporadic outbreaks of fighting after that, but we are still pretty much at that armistice line. Eisenhower labeled his politics modern republicanism. Ike believed in a conservative government spending and a balanced budget, had no desire to end the New Deal programs, and will lead us through the affluent post-war good life at home, which is dependent upon strong Cold War foreign policy and spending on the Cold War. And that very much comes from NSC 68 that we read an excerpt of, I believe, and filled out the flashcards for. And a good quotation by Eisenhower: "I'm conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings." And we'll see that how he's liberal with human beings, especially in Arkansas with the integration of Little Rock High School. So in his 8 years as record, Ike had a modest domestic record. Instead of ending New Deal programs, Eisenhower added to Social Security and minimum wage, two things that the Republicans had denied in Truman's fair deal. He used FDR's Federal Housing Administration from the New Deal to help finance building the purchase of suburban homes. And he created the Departments of Health, Education, and Welfare. And especially in a time in which many Republicans in our modern era, not to be confused with Eisenhower's modern republicanism, want to get rid of things like the Department of Health, Education, Welfare, and even the FHA. You see Eisenhower as a post-World War II modern Republican wanting to expand them and use them. So that's where we have to really differentiate the modern Republicans with a capital M, capital R of Eisenhower, I would say until Nixon, with the just, lowercase m, common noun, modern Republicans of the neoconservative movement after Reagan. So during the Eisenhower era, the U.S. economy avoided spiraling inflation and brought middle-class prosperity to more Americans, and that's something we'll come back to. And so after 1947, 1948, we had started this with the economic downturn. Oh, my husband's calling me. Hold on, I'm going to pause here for a second. Okay, sorry, my husband's at the grocery store and it appears that there's no frozen vegetables left. Okay, so let's see, where did I leave off? I know I read this, right, so I think I was explaining that after, we started the presentation here with that after World War II, the economy did kind of contract, 46, 47, 48, and however, really the Marshall Plan helps first lead us out of that. All of the Marshall Plan aid that's going to go to Europe, whether it's building materials, food, machines to build things with, that's my husband again, all come from American companies. The food comes from American farms. It really does helps our economy turn around. And then the continued spending on the Cold War from the late 40s throughout the 50s is really going to lead this economic change that we're going to explore in probably the next video. So I'll leave you with those key concepts because this is where this is all leading to. Explain the causes of economic growth in the years after World War II. This is your key question from the next page. If you just flip the page over to topic 8.4, the economy, what are the causes of economic growth? So you can start to write down, I should write it down too. I'm looking for a pen. Causes of economic growth are going to be Marshall Plan, and you can go more in depth with that. Causes of economic growth are going to be NSC 68, and then we'll add to some more, but also just Cold War spending. And I noted here that after that period of economic downturn, after World War II, the U.S. economy experienced unprecedented economic growth for the next 20 years. And it'll start to come to an end in the late 1960s, largely from a tax plan that JFK puts in. At the same time, we're ramping up to foreign and domestic spending programs, but pretty much the 1970s is when the economic growth ends. So you have about 20 to 25 years of economic growth. And then, we can skip these and wait till our next video. So I am going to sign out for now. You can always ask questions on the shared doc I posted, and we'll see each other later this week. Bye.